I was not drafted into glory. Glory requires witnesses, and there are no witnesses in the lower decks. My reassignment came without ceremony, delivered through a stamped allocation notice affixed to a cogitator slate that was already cracked when it reached my hands. I do not remember volunteering, because I did not. I do not remember refusing, because refusal is not a category recognized by the Voidship's personnel system. The order bore my designation, my threat rating, my labor suitability index, and a destination code that meant nothing to me at the time. Only later did I learn what it translated to in the ship's internal catechisms: sanitation detail, tertiary waste maintenance, deep deck assignment. The officer who handed me the slate did not meet my eyes. He read from a list, his voice flat, practiced, already halfway on to the next name. The entire exchange took less than 10 seconds. That was how my life changed direction, not with a speech, not with a sentence, but with a bureaucratic pivot so minor, it barely registered as movement. The lift ride down took nearly an hour. The Voidship is vast in ways no planet ever prepared me for. It is not simply large, it is layered, recursive, built upon centuries of additions, repairs, and sacred compromises. The lift groaned as it descended, lumen strips flickering overhead, each level passing marked by changes in air pressure and smell. The upper decks smelled of incense, recycled oxygen, and machine oil kept clean enough to be respectable. The middle decks introduced sweat, unwashed bodies, and the faint copper tang of overworked systems. The lower decks smelled like rust and waste. By the time the lift doors opened, my eyes were already watering. The air was thicker here, heavier, as if it resisted being inhaled. The lighting was dim by design, power rationed to what was deemed operationally sufficient. Shadows pooled in corners and along bulkhead seams, giving the impression that the ship itself was reluctant to reveal this part of its body. A sanitation overseer met me at the lift. He wore a stained coat, once white, now a patchwork of discoloration that told a story I did not want to hear. He checked my slate, nodded once, and handed me a tool without introduction. "Scraper," he said. "Report rotation posted every 6 hours. Don't wander. Don't touch what isn't yours. If something moves that shouldn't, log it and keep working." That was my orientation. The first thing I learned was that light is a privilege. In the lower decks, lumen globes are spaced far apart, their glow weak and yellowed, more symbolic than functional. We worked by feel as much as sight, hands tracing along pipes slick with condensation and residue, boots sinking slightly into floors perpetually damp with runoff. The ship groaned constantly, metal contracting, engines humming far above, fluids rushing through unseen channels. It was never silent, but it was never loud enough to drown out your own breathing, which was perhaps the cruelest part. The second thing I learned was that cleanliness is a sacred duty spoken of only by those who do not perform it. The officers preached purity in sermons broadcast through the Vox net, their voices echoing faintly down into the lower decks, distorted by distance and poor signal quality. They spoke of rot as heresy, of decay as a moral failing, of cleanliness as loyalty to the throne. Their words filtered down to us as background noise, half heard and wholly irrelevant. None of them ever descended to witness it. Sanitation was not about making things clean. It was about preventing collapse. Waste accumulates quickly on a Voidship: human waste, chemical runoff, coolant leaks, organic matter shed by thousands of bodies packed into pressurized corridors. Left unattended, it clogs systems, corrodes supports, breeds disease. Our job was to keep the ship from choking on its own excess. We were not cleaners. We were internal pressure valves. My first shift lasted 12 hours, or perhaps 14. Time behaves strangely when measured only by exhaustion. I scraped residue from a waste channel that had not been properly serviced in decades, the build-up layered thick enough to require repeated passes. My gloves were already compromised within the first hour, seams splitting under constant abrasion. I logged the failure as required, noting the serial number and time of exposure. No replacement came. By the end of the shift, my hands burned constantly, a low, persistent ache that pulsed with every movement. When I removed my gloves, the skin beneath was pale and wrinkled, faintly tinged with yellow where the chemicals had seeped through. I washed them in recycled water that smelled faintly of what it had once been. I ate afterward, Rations were issued at a sanitation mess hall, carved into what had once been a maintenance bay. The food was nutrient paste extruded into uniform blocks, flavorless and warm, served with recaf so thin it barely qualified as stimulant. As I chewed, I realized with a jolt of revulsion that the taste was familiar. It tasted like my work. From that moment on, every meal carried the faint echo of waste and rust. It did not matter what additives were used, what prayers were spoken over it. Once you have breathed the lower decks long enough, everything tastes the same. I began to understand how the ship viewed us. We were part of its digestive tract, necessary, unpleasant, unseen. The Voidship did not acknowledge us. It did not thank us. It did not even record us properly. Our presence was implied, assumed, factored into maintenance projections as labor, hours rather than names. When a sanitation crewman went missing, and they did go missing, it was logged as operational fluctuation, unless it caused a blockage somewhere important. I learned to read the ship's priorities by what triggered alarms. A clogged waste conduit on a crew deck warranted a response. The same blockage on a lower deck could sit for cycles, compounding, spreading, until it threatened something higher up. Only then did it matter. Only then did we matter. By the end of my first cycle, I no longer thought of myself as a person assigned to sanitation. I thought of myself as sanitation given legs and hands. My worth was measured in cleared meters, in pressure normalized, in leaks delayed. The Voidship rolled on through the dark between stars, uncaring, immense, alive in a way that did not include compassion. And I understood, with a clarity that left no room for hope, that my life would now be measured in hours spent scraping filth from a vessel that would never notice me. The ship did not hate us. Hate requires attention. We were something worse. We were maintenance. The lower decks teach you quickly that unding is a word meant for other people. There is no end to waste on a void ship. Not while air still circulates. Not while bodies still sweat and bleed and eat and fear. Not while machines exhale heat and fluids into the arteries of the hull. Everything produces runoff. Everything leaves residue. Even prayer in its own way leaves ash, candle drippings, incense soot. Scraps of parchment charms peeled from bulkheads and tossed aside when they no longer stick. Above, the Voidship is spoken of as a holy engine, a cathedral of steel carrying mankind's will between stars. Below, it is a living sewer that never stops swallowing. My assignment after the first cycle moved me from scraping channels to the collection chambers, large, echoing cavities where multiple waste lines converged into reservoirs the size of hab blocks. The ceiling was lost in shadow. The walls sweated constantly. The floor was slick, not with water, but with everything water carries when it has been forced to serve too many masters. The smell hit me like a physical blow every time I entered. Disinfectant tried to mask it, leaving a sharp chemical sting that burned the back of my throat, but nothing truly covered the rot. Waste has 100 notes: ammonia, bile, decay, metallic tang from blood traces, soreness from spoiled nutrients, and the unmistakable oily scent of coolant leaking from cracked pipes overhead. It layered itself into the air until breathing felt like chewing. We wore respirators. In theory, in practice, the filters were old, refilled and resealed so many times the seals no longer held properly. We were issued masks with serial numbers logged against our names, and we were told to maintain them through proper machine rites. The overseer spoke the ritual words over a crate of filters like he was blessing relics. Replace when indicator shows yellow, he instructed. Red is violation. Red is negligence. My indicator turned yellow within minutes. It turned red within the hour. I logged it. I filed the maintenance request. I attached the correct seal, recited the correct request formula, and handed it up the chain. The reply came back 2 cycles later. Request denied. Operational resources allocated to essential systems. I stared at the denial notice until the paper went soft in my fingers. It was stamped properly, with all necessary approvals. It did not even feel cruel. It felt automatic. It taught me something about the ship's definition of essential. The waste continued regardless. Refuse flowed endlessly through broken pipes and overflowing junctions. Thick sludge gurgled through grates, sometimes backing up in sudden surges that splashed against our boots and shins. We worked with shovels, scrapers, and hooked poles, redirecting flow, clearing blockages, pushing clumps of congealed matter into channels meant to carry it away. Often, those channels did not carry it away. They simply moved it somewhere else. The work was physical, constant, and degrading in ways that went beyond filth. It was the knowledge that no matter how much you cleared, more would come. No matter how clean you scraped a section, it would be coated again within hours. The ship produced waste faster than we could process it. Our labor did not solve the problem, it only delayed catastrophe, and catastrophe, when it came, was always blamed on us. When a pipe ruptured and flooded a corridor, the overseer wrote up a negligence report. When pressure spiked and a valve jammed, the tech adept demanded to know why we had not performed proper rites. When disease spread through the lower habs, the medica listed sanitation deficiency as a contributing factor. They never listed resource denial. They never listed structural decay. Those were beyond the scope of the form. Above us, alarms wailed for battles we would never see. I heard them through the vents, red alert tones vibrating through pipes, muffled announcements of boarding actions or gunnery engagements, prayers broadcast at higher volume to raise morale. The first time I heard a full ship-wide alarm from inside a collection chamber, I froze, shovel halfway lifted, heart hammering as if I could somehow be called to fight. No one moved. The overseer glanced up at the ceiling, listened for a moment, then returned to his work. "Doesn't change our schedule," he said. And it didn't. Protective gear failed often, gloves split, boots dissolved, masks clogged. We patched what we could with sealant and cloth strips, repeating the maintenance litanies like desperate charms. Sometimes the ship's own systems would spray disinfectant in an automated purge cycle, coating everything, including us, in a stinging mist that made eyes water and skin blister if exposed too long. Those blister incidents were logged as acceptable occupational exposure. That phrase followed me. It appeared everywhere, on medica forms, on equipment denial slips, on casualty reports when a sanitation worker collapsed into a channel and was swept away before anyone could pull him out. Acceptable, occupational, as if suffering was simply a job requirement. Every breath burned my lungs, not dramatically, not as a sudden choking, more like a slow erosion. Each inhale carried microscopic particles of rot and chemical fumes. Coughs became common. Everyone had one. The sound echoed in the tunnels like a chorus, wet, rasping, inevitable. Some men coughed blood. Others coughed thick mucus that smelled faintly of disinfectant. The medici gave us bitter lozenges and told us to continue working. "It's the air," one said once, almost apologetically, as he checked my breathing with cold instruments. "It's always been the air. You're just noticing it now." That sentence felt like a condemnation. Every meal tasted faintly of what I cleaned away. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was psychological, that my senses were contaminated by smell. But the taste persisted even when I ate in sealed quarters, even when I held my breath between bites. The void ship recycled everything: water, air, nutrients. Waste was not discarded, it was processed and returned. We were literally eating our labor. The ship fed on us as much as it fed on fuel. I began to see that in small details. The way our rations were measured precisely to keep us functional, but never comfortable. The way our shifts were scheduled to maximize output regardless of exhaustion. The way our deaths were recorded only when they interrupted flow. Once, a sanitation worker, an older man with cracked hands and eyes that never fully opened, fell into a waste channel during a surge. He slipped without a sound, pulled under thick sludge. We reached for him, hands grasping at air and filth, but the current took him instantly. The overseer did not order a recovery. He ordered a blockage check. We spent the next hour ensuring his body did not lodge in a pipe. When the shift ended, I filed the report. Cause of casualty: workplace accident. Impact on operations minimal. Corrective action: increased grip checks on floor surfaces. I wanted to vomit. Instead, I went to the mess hall and ate my block of paste, tasting him in every bite. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was merely unpleasant work. It was a system, a cycle: waste produced, waste processed, labor consumed, bodies expended, paper stamped, routine preserved. Above, men fought and died with banners and honors, their sacrifices sung in sermons. Down here we died quietly, dissolved into runoff, becoming part of the ship's endless internal flow. And still, every cycle, the refuse came. It always came. There was no victory condition in sanitation, no clean enough, only not yet catastrophic. The ship did not want us to succeed, it wanted us to continue. The first body I pulled from a waste channel did not look like a person anymore. It looked like a blockage. That is the thought that shames me most. Even now, not fear, not disgust, but recognition. I saw the way the sludge pooled unnaturally around something solid, the way the flow pattern changed, backing up against a shape that should not have been there. My mind did not say man, it said problem. Get the hook, the overseer said, already writing on his slate. We worked without speaking. Two of us braced ourselves against the slick floor, while another lowered a magnetized line into the channel. The smell was overwhelming. Waste, rot, chemicals, and something sweeter beneath it all, the unmistakable scent of flesh that had been broken down by time and pressure. When the hook caught, there was resistance, then a sudden give. The body surfaced slowly, dragged free inch by inch. His uniform had fused to him. Fabric eaten away, insignia dissolved, rank rendered meaningless by corrosion. His face was gone, not destroyed violently, but worn down, smoothed by constant exposure until only bone and gristle remained. One eye socket stared blankly. The other still held an eye, clouded and half liquefied. I recognized the boots. That was how it usually happened. Boots, teeth, fragments of augmetic plating, those were the things that survived long enough to identify someone. Faces were a luxury of the upper decks. Down here, the dead were reduced to durable components. The overseer checked the slate. Crew designation matches sanitation, he said. Lower shift, missing 2 cycles. 2 cycles. He had been gone long enough for the ship to start digesting him. We logged the retrieval as a successful clearance. The body was transferred to processing, not to a morgue, because sanitation dead did not qualify for one, but to the same systems that handled waste reclamation. Rank determined routing. Officers went one way, specialists another. Sanitation crew went where flow was most efficient. I remember hesitating, standing there with my gloves slick and my arms aching, staring at what remained of him. Prayer, I asked quietly. The overseer looked at me like I had suggested shutting down an engine mid-battle. Do it if you want, he said. But don't slow the line. I muttered something under my breath, half-remembered words from a catechism I hadn't spoken since conscription. It felt thin and useless, a whisper swallowed by the chamber's echo. Then we fed the body into the intake and watched it disappear. The dead did not leave the ship. They circulated. That was the truth no one said aloud. Void ships cannot afford burial. Space is too valuable, mass too costly. Bodies are resources, organic matter to be broken down, rendered, repurposed. Even the honored dead are recycled eventually, their ashes mixed into machine lubricants or structural composites, blessed by priests who never ask, whose remains they sanctify. For us, there was no delay. Sanitation dead were processed immediately unless rank intervened. A lieutenant's corpse would be flagged, sealed, transported upward for rites and recording. A sanitation worker's body became another maintenance issue, another potential blockage. I learned to recognize crewmates by fragments, a distinctive augmetic finger, a dental implant stamped with a manufacturum code, a tattoo half erased by chemical exposure. We would pause just long enough to confirm identity. If identity was still possible, then log and move on. The paperwork mattered more than the remains. That was another lesson. The forms demanded closure. A death had to be accounted for, even if the person had not been missed while alive. But the accounting was shallow. 'Cause location, time. No space for memory, no space for grief. Prayers were optional, efficiency was not. Sometimes bodies arrived already broken down, reduced to partial obstructions lodged in filters or grates. We would extract them piece by piece, laying fragments on tops to ensure nothing remained that could clog the system. Once, I spent an entire shift pulling bone shards from a mesh screen, each one clicking softly as it dropped into a collection bin. I did not know who it had been. The ledger did, or claimed to. Names appeared and vanished on sanitation rosters with disturbing regularity. Men would stop showing up for shift, and only later would we find their remains somewhere deep in the ship's arteries. Sometimes we found nothing at all, just an empty slot on the duty rotation quietly reassigned. No announcement, No acknowledgement. Death was only noticed when it interfered with function. That changed the way I looked at people. I began to see my fellow crew not as individuals, but as potential obstructions, points where flesh might fail and enter the system unexpectedly. I hated myself for it, but the thought crept in anyway. It was easier to think that way, easier to survive. Once a young crewman, new assignment, eyes still sharp with fear, slipped on a slick and nearly went into a channel. I grabbed him in time, my gloves scraping against his armor, barely holding on. He stared at me, shaking, breath coming in gasps. "Thank you," he said. I nodded, pulling him back onto solid footing. Later that cycle, I found his name on the processing log. He had fallen in somewhere else. No one had seen it happen. By the time the blockage alarm sounded, there was nothing left to recover intact. I stopped feeling relief when I saved someone. Relief implied expectation. I learned to work faster, not out of dedication, but out of fear, fear that hesitation would make me next. Fear that slowing down would give the ship time to claim me. I scraped harder, shoveled faster, ignored the burning in my lungs and the tremor in my hands. The overseer noticed. "Good output," he said once, marking my slate. "Ship needs more like you." The praise made my stomach turn, because I understood what it meant. Bodies clog drainage systems more often than debris. That is not hyperbole. Flesh is soft. It conforms to pipes, wraps around valves, lodges where rigid waste might pass through. The ship's systems were not designed with human fragility in mind. They were designed for flow. We learned the patterns. Where bodies tended to lodge. How long it took before decomposition made removal easier or harder. We adjusted procedures accordingly, developing unofficial techniques that were never written down but passed quietly between crews. Knowledge born of necessity. I watched one sanitation worker, older, slower, pause too long before extracting a corpse. He stood there staring, lips moving silently. Perhaps he recognized the remains. Perhaps he was praying. Perhaps he was simply tired. The overseer shoved him aside. "Move," he snapped. "It's backing up." The man stumbled, lost his footing, and slipped into the channel. We did not reach for him. Not because we did not care, because we knew better. The flow took him instantly. The overseer cursed, not in grief but in irritation. "Log it," he said. I logged it. 2 deaths, 1 obstruction cleared. Net operational impact neutral. That night, I dreamed of pipes, endless corridors of steel, slick with residue, carrying fragments of people past me in slow, grinding currents. I woke choking, convinced for a moment that I was already inside one, that my lungs were filling with the same sludge I spent my days moving. The dream never stopped returning. Death had become another maintenance task. Not dramatic, not honorable, just another thing to scrape, redirect, and forget. And I understood, with a clarity that hollowed me out, that as long as the ship required sanitation, it would accept our dead gladly. The dead do not leave the ship. They become part of it. Battle does not stop the waste. That was the first truth drilled into us when the alarms began to scream and the deck plates trembled beneath our boots. Guns thundered above. Void shields flared and failed in distant sections, and somewhere far from the lower decks men fought and died in flashes of light and noise. Down where I worked, nothing paused. The refuse still flowed, the pipes still backed up, gravity still pulled blood, oil, and filth downward into our domain. If anything, war made our labor worse. The first hull breach I experienced was not dramatic. There was no sudden explosion in my section, no heroic rush to seal the void. Instead, there was a low groan that rippled through the ship like a sick animal shifting its weight. Then the pressure changed. Air screamed through vents in the wrong direction, and moments later, everything that had been contained above us came down. Blood first. Hot, sticky, copper-scented blood poured through the drainage grates, carrying fragments of armor, scraps of cloth, and things I refused to identify. The channels clogged instantly. Alarms flared red on our panels. "Move!" The overseer barked. "We don't clear it. Decks 14 through 19 flood." We ran. We always ran. Our orders were explicit. Sanitation operations were to continue uninterrupted during combat, unless directly overridden by senior command. Such overrides never came. The officers needed us invisible and functional. If the lower decks flooded, they lost power, stability, and eventually the ability to fight. Our survival mattered only as long as it supported theirs. The corridors were dark. Emergency lights flickered, casting everything in stuttering red pulses. Steam hissed from ruptured lines, turning the air into a scalding fog. Somewhere nearby something detonated, and the deck buckled just enough to throw me off balance. I caught myself on a railing slick with blood, not mine. We reached the breach point, a junction where 3 waste channels met beneath a gunnery deck that no longer existed in its proper shape. The pressure differential had forced everything downward. Overwhelming containment seals, blood, hydraulic fluid, coolant, and pulverized matter churned together into a thick, moving mass. "Cell valve gamma!" someone shouted. "I can't, it's jammed." "Then cut it." We worked by feel more than sight, hacking at access panels with tools never meant for this kind of damage. My hands shook, partly from fear, partly from exhaustion. The smell was unbearable: burnt flesh, ionized metal, and the sour tang of void exposure. Above us, people were dying. Below us, they were becoming our responsibility. Screams came through the vents. Not directly, filtered, distorted, carried along airflow ducts like echoes of echoes. Sometimes it was impossible to tell if they were current or just memories replayed by damaged systems. Either way, they did not change our orders. Keep working. One of the crew slipped, fell into the slurry up to his waist. He screamed as the chemicals ate through his protective gear, skin blistering beneath. We pulled him free, dragging him back onto solid plating. "Medica," he gasped. The overseer shook his head. "Finish the job," he said. "Then we'll log it." The man lived, barely. He was reassigned 2 cycles later with bandages still seeping. There was no time for recovery during battle. There was only function. The worst part of sanitation during combat was the darkness. Power fluctuations plunged entire sections into blackness, forcing us to work with lumen globes clipped to our chests, their light barely cutting through smoke and steam. In that darkness, orientation vanished. Up and down became suggestions. Pipes groaned like living things, shifting under stress, threatening to rupture at any moment. We sealed one breach only to hear alarms screaming from another section moments later. Section 20. 3 flooding. Deck valves failing. Structural integrity compromised. Each alert was a choice. Seal one area, doom another. We were never given enough resources to save everything. We triaged filth the way Medica triaged wounds, calculating which failures would kill the ship fastest if left unattended. Sometimes that meant letting entire compartments drown so others could stay dry. I still remember the first time I knowingly condemned people. The order came down fast and impersonal: seal bulkheads 7 through 10. Those sections housed crew quarters and a secondary chapel. Sealing them would prevent a pressure cascade that could cripple the reactor conduits. "Those decks are still occupied," someone whispered. The overseer didn't hesitate. "Seal them." I reached the control panel with shaking hands. My thumb hovered over the rune for just a heartbeat longer than allowed. Then I pressed it. The bulkhead slammed shut with a sound like a coffin lid being dropped. The alarms shifted tone, acknowledging compliance. Somewhere behind those walls, men and women screamed as air vanished and waste surged unchecked. We never spoke of it again. Victory came hours later, announced through Vox with triumphant rhetoric and casualty numbers stripped of context. Above decks celebrated survival. Down below we cleaned. We always cleaned. After the guns fell silent, the real work began. Battle left behind rivers of debris, spent casings, blood-soaked insulation, fragments of bodies that had nowhere else to go. We worked for cycles without rest, hands blistered raw, lungs burning, minds numb. No commendations came for sanitation crews after engagements. No honors. Our reward was being allowed to continue existing. One night, exhausted beyond thought, I leaned against a bulkhead and listened to the distant hymns echoing from the upper chapels, songs of victory, of faith renewed, of enemies destroyed. Down where I stood, the hymns sounded hollow, warped by distance and ductwork. They mingled with the drip of fluids and the hum of overworked pumps, forming a soundtrack that felt more honest than any sermon. Victory only meant more mess to clean, more blood to move, more dead to process. I began to dread battles not because of the enemy, but because of the aftermath. because I knew that every salvo fired above meant another tide of filth crashing down onto us. Because I knew that the ship would demand we absorb the consequences quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. War did not elevate us. It buried us deeper. And as I scraped another layer of residue from a deck, plate scarred by shrapnel and scorch marks, I understood that in the grand calculus of void warfare, sanitation crews were not support, we were damage control for humanity itself. Being forgotten is not the same as being ignored. Ignored implies awareness. Forgotten is cleaner, quieter, and far more lethal. It began with the supplies. At first, it was subtle. A crate of replacement filters arrived half empty. A shipment of gloves contained the wrong sizes, the material thinner than regulation. We logged the discrepancies the way we were trained to: date, time, serial numbers, signatures. The forms disappeared upward through proper channels and never returned. No rejection notices, no corrections, just silence. Silence, I learned, is how the Imperium tells you that you are no longer essential. The ration allocations changed next. Not officially, no stamped orders, no revisions to the posted schedules, but the portions grew smaller. Nutrient blocks arrived cracked, some already spoiled at the edges. The ricav thinned until it barely tinted the water. When we asked the quartermaster above deck, he blinked at us as if seeing sanitation crewmen for the first time. "Your allotment hasn't changed," he said, consulting a slate that showed neat numbers and perfect compliance. "If you're short, the error is local. Local errors were our problem. Systemic ones belonged to someone else. Our tools began to fail more often. Scrapers snapped under pressure, pump seals leaked, portable lumen globes dimmed and died mid-shift, forcing us to work blind until someone could salvage another from a sealed section. We requested replacements. We received instructions to extend operational lifespan through approved maintenance rituals. Approved maintenance rituals amounted to prayer and improvisation. The lower decks grew darker. Without sufficient lighting, work slowed. Slower work meant more accumulation. More accumulation meant higher risk of system failure. Each delay fed the next, a spiral of neglect that no amount of effort could fully counter. We worked longer shifts to compensate, rotating sleep in short, uneven blocks on metal bunks slick with condensation. Exhaustion became our baseline. Above us, life went on. I knew this because I heard it. Faint echoes of music during victory cycles, laughter drifting down ventilation shafts during feast observances, the distant clang of ceremonies marking promotions and honors. The crew above spoke of morale in official broadcasts, praising unity, sacrifice, and the unseen labor that sustained the ship. They never named us. We existed only as a concept, not as people. One cycle, a delegation from upper maintenance passed through our section en route to inspect a coolant failure further down. They wore clean boots and fresh uniforms, their breathing masks pristine. As they walked, they wrinkled their noses, discomfort plain even through filters. "How do you live down here?" one asked, half laughing. No one answered. There was no point. Requests for additional manpower were denied as non-critical. When 2 crewmen collapsed during a shift, one from exhaustion, one from exposure, the incident report classified it as expected attrition within acceptable parameters. Their bunks were reassigned before their bodies were cold. We began cannibalizing abandoned sections for parts, prying intact components from sealed compartments marked unsafe. The ship tolerated this as long as the upper decks remained functional. It did not care how we sustained ourselves, only that the rot did not reach its vital organs. Faith visits stopped. Once a ministorum preacher descended to bless the lower decks, his presence heralded by incense and escorts. He spoke of purity, of endurance, of suffering as devotion. He stayed less than an hour. After that, no chaplain ever returned. The lower decks fell off the map of spiritual necessity. Some of the crew began whispering that we had been deliberately written off, listed as operational, but excluded from long-term planning. A way to bleed manpower quietly without the paperwork of executions or penal transfers. At first, I dismissed it as bitterness. Then I noticed the rosters. Our crew list no longer updated properly. Names of the dead remained for cycles, while replacements never appeared. Transfers into sanitation stopped entirely. We aged in place, a closed system grinding itself down. We were not meant to be replaced. One night, during a brief rest cycle, I climbed to an access hatch that opened into a rarely used conduit linking to a mid-deck corridor. I wanted to see it again, to remind myself that the ship contained something other than rust and waste. I cracked the hatch and looked through. The corridor beyond was clean, brightly lit. Crew walked past in orderly lines, uniforms pressed, boots polished. They spoke casually, complained about minor inconveniences, ration flavors, drill schedules, the boredom of long voyages. None of them looked down. I closed the hatch quietly and returned to my section, feeling like I had glimpsed another reality rather than another deck. From that point on, something inside me hardened. I stopped expecting acknowledgement, stopped hoping for relief. My world shrank to the corridors I scrubbed, the pipes I cleared, the systems I kept barely functional. The ship's indifference became predictable, almost comforting in its consistency. We joked darkly that we were ghosts haunting the void ship's gut, unseen and uncounted. But ghosts are remembered. We were infrastructure. The crew above depended on us without knowing it. Their clean corridors, their breathable air, their functioning sanitation, all of it rested on our backs. And yet, if we failed, the blame would not rise with the waste. It would stay with us, recorded as negligence, dereliction, or incompetence. That was the cruel symmetry of it. We were responsible for everything and credited with nothing. One shift. As I scraped corrosion from a support strut that had not been inspected in generations, I realized that no one above would notice if I stopped. Not immediately. The effects would ripple slowly, minor failures at first, then compounding catastrophes. By the time anyone asked why the lower decks had failed, I would already be gone. Forgotten. The ship did not hate us. The crew above did not despise us. They simply lived their lives on a foundation they never questioned, trusting that filth would always be handled by someone else. By us. And as I worked on, hands raw, lungs burning, surrounded by decay that no one would ever see, I understood a truth more bitter than hunger's. We were invisible labor sustaining lives that would never acknowledge us. And invisibility, in the Imperium, is a slow death. Disease did not arrive in the lower decks like an invasion. It seeped in quietly, the way everything else did, through condensation, through microfractures in pipes, through lungs already weakened by years of breathing recycled rot. By the time anyone named it, it had already become routine. At first, it was just coughs. Dry, persistent hacking that echoed through the corridors during shifts. We logged them as respiratory irritation, the kind expected from prolonged exposure. The overseer nodded, added his mark, and reminded us to rotate breathing filters more frequently, filters we no longer had enough of. When fevers followed, they were dismissed as fatigue response. When rashes bloomed under protective gear, we were told to wash more thoroughly. Wash. In water recycled from waste. The medici arrived late, as they always did, their boots sealed, their masks humming softly as they surveyed us from a safe distance. They took samples, prodded swollen glands with gloved fingers, and spoke in low, clinical tones. I heard phrases like environmentally induced degeneration and acceptable exposure curve. One of them smiled faintly as he said it, as if pleased by the neatness of the classification. Treatment was minimal. A handful of injectors distributed with strict instructions. A rotation of quarantined work zones established, not to prevent spread, but to contain it within predictable boundaries. Those assigned to contaminated sections were sealed in with their tools and told to continue operations unless incapacitation occurred. Incapacitation meant death or unconsciousness. I watched a man named Kest lose feeling in his fingers over the course of a week. He complained at first, then stopped. By the time his hands turned blackened and rigid, he could no longer grip his scraper. The overseer reassigned him to monitoring duty, standing in a corner, eyes glazed, recording pressure readings until he collapsed. They dragged him away and logged the zone as biologically stabilized. Quarantine did not mean rest, it meant isolation. Sections marked contaminated were sealed off, doors locked, vents rerouted. We lived and worked in the same damp corridors, sleeping in shifts amid the hum of failing systems and the wet coughs of those growing worse. Medica visits were infrequent and brief, conducted through inspection ports or holo feeds. If someone recovered, they returned to duty immediately. If they did not, their body was processed. Disease changed how we looked at one another. Every cough became a threat. Every scrape or blister a potential death sentence. We avoided touching when we could, a difficult task in corridors barely wide enough for two. Protective rituals replaced conversation, mask checks, seal inspections, whispered litanies muttered before shifts. The ship did not slow to accommodate us. It never does. Workloads remained constant. In fact, they increased as fewer hands remained capable. Survivors took on double shifts, triple zones, longer rotations. Fatigue deepened, immune systems weakened further, and the cycle fed itself. The Medica logged it all, charts updated, projections adjusted. Attrition curves smoothed into acceptable gradients. Illness was not considered a failure of the system. It was considered an expected cost. I fell ill during a maintenance cycle in a sealed drainage nexus. The symptoms came fast: dizziness, nausea, a burning sensation deep in my chest that made every breath feel like inhaling hot dust. I reported it, as required. The overseer looked at me for a long moment, then checked the roster. "We'll rotate you out after this shift," he said. The shift lasted 16 hours. By the time I staggered back to the bunks, my vision blurred at the edges. I remember lying on the metal slab, listening to the wet breathing of others around me, wondering if this was the point where I would simply stop getting up. I did not want to die. Not because life was precious, but because death here was so thoroughly unremarkable. I survived. Most of us did in some form. Survival, however, did not mean recovery. It meant adaptation. Persistent tremors, lingering coughs, skin that never fully healed. We returned to duty marked but functional. Our bodies changed in ways no one above would ever record. Those who did not survive were replaced not by people, but by redistributed labor. The ship did not pause to mourn. It recalculated. In time, I stopped thinking of disease as something to be avoided. It was simply another condition of service, like low light or poor air. You learned its rhythms, its warning signs. You learned how much pain you could ignore before it interfered with your work. I realized then that illness was not a flaw in the sanitation system. It was part of it. We absorbed rot so the ship did not have to. That included biological rot. Our bodies were buffers, sacrificial layers between decay and functionality. If we broke down, it meant the system was working as intended. That understanding settled over me like a second skin. When the next outbreak came, and it always did, I no longer asked why help was slow or insufficient. I no longer expected cures. I focused on staying just functional enough to keep moving, to keep scraping, to keep the waste flowing away from critical systems. Illness did not terrify me anymore. Being relieved of duty did. Because those who could no longer work were not healed, they were removed. And in the Imperium, removal is the closest thing to mercy you can expect, if you are lucky enough to be noticed. There comes a moment when you stop believing the ship is indifferent. I cannot mark the exact cycle it happened. Time in the lower decks has no clean edges, only repetition and fatigue, but I remember the feeling clearly. It was the sensation of being watched by something that had no eyes, judged by something that had no language for mercy. The machine spirits began to misbehave. That was the official phrasing. Not malfunction, not failure, but restlessness. The tech adepts used the word with reverence and fear, as if describing a wounded animal rather than a collection of ancient systems held together by ritual and denial. They did not descend to our level. They spoke through vox grilles and prayer cant relays, instructing us to perform appeasement rites we barely understood. Doors sealed without command. At first, it was isolated, bulkheads snapping shut during routine operations, forcing us to reroute through longer, more dangerous paths. We logged the incidents. The logs disappeared. Then the doors began to seal behind us, cutting off retreat, trapping crews in sections with rising waste levels and failing air recyclers. One team went into a reclamation chamber to clear a blockage. The door closed behind them. No alarm sounded. No override worked. We heard them banging on the bulkhead for hours before the sound stopped. The incident was recorded as loss due to environmental hazard. Vents reversed airflow without warning, blasting us with concentrated fumes that sent men retching to their knees. Waste floods surged suddenly, as if valves had been opened deliberately upstream. Pressure readings fluctuated in patterns too precise to be random, spiking exactly where crews were densest. Some whispered that the ship hated us, others said it barely noticed us at all, and that was worse. I began to feel it in smaller ways. Panels that had always responded stopped accepting my inputs. Access hatches resisted opening unless struck just so, like stubborn jaws. Lumen globes flickered when I approached, dimming as if withdrawing light from me specifically. Once, in a forgotten junction deep below the mapped decks, I heard my name spoken, softly, clearly. From inside the wall, I froze, heart hammering, every instinct screaming at me to run. I whispered the litany of protection, words drilled into me since childhood, my voice trembling in the stale air. The sound did not repeat. The wall remained inert. I logged nothing. Sanitation crews were reassigned into zones no longer maintained on official schematics. The maps stopped matching reality. Corridors twisted where they should not, leading back on themselves or opening into vast, echoing chambers filled with debris and silence. Some of these spaces felt old, older than the ship's recorded construction dates, layered beneath later expansions like buried bones. Crews sent into these zones rarely returned. When they did, they were changed, quieter, eyes unfocused. They spoke of echoes that moved independently of sound, of shadows cast by nothing, of machines that whispered apologies while sealing doors. Medicare cleared them as psychologically degraded but operational. Operational. That word again. I began to suspect that the ship had learned us, not individually, but as a function. As something it could use, when systems strained. Sanitation crews were redirected automatically, funneled toward the worst failures without orders ever being issued. It was as if the Voidship had internalized our role so completely that it no longer required human oversight. We were antibodies, deployed instinctively, and like all antibodies, expendable. One cycle, my crew received an assignment to clear a blockage in a sector marked simply as unallocated. No deck number, no historical data. Just coordinates and a warning rune I had never seen before. The overseer hesitated, then shrugged. "The ship knows where it needs us," he said. We went. The corridor narrowed the deeper we traveled, walls closing in, the air growing warmer and wetter. The hum of the ship grew louder, overlapping rhythms that set my teeth on edge. I felt pressure behind my eyes, a sensation like being pressed into something vast and uncaring. At the end of the passage was a chamber filled with waste up to the knees, decades of accumulated runoff swirling slowly around broken machinery. And embedded in the far wall, half submerged, was a door that pulsed faintly, its surface warm to the touch. It opened as we approached. None of us had issued a command. The overseer stepped back. "No," he whispered. "This isn't." The door closed again, a moment later. A surge of waste roared through the chamber, knocking us off our feet. I remember being dragged along the floor, scraping against jagged metal, my grip slipping. Someone screamed. Someone prayed. Then the pressure equalized, and the flow stopped as abruptly as it had begun. 2 of us were missing. The system status panel lit up green. Blockage cleared. It reported. We stumbled back to safer decks, shaken and silent. The overseer filed the report with shaking hands. The response came back within minutes. Sanitation effectiveness within optimal parameters. That was when I understood. The ship did not turn inward out of malice. It turned inward out of necessity. When resources ran thin, when systems aged beyond repair, it consumed what it could reach. Sanitation crews were already deep inside its body, already accustomed to filth and sacrifice. We were the easiest to redirect, the least disruptive to lose. We were fed into the ship to keep it running. From that day on, every assignment felt like a judgment. Every sealed door a possible execution. I worked with the constant awareness that at any moment, the ship might decide I was more useful as material than as labor. I stopped thinking of the Voidship as a vessel. It was a god machine in slow decline, and like all dying gods, it demanded offerings. We were those offerings. The roster shrank without announcement, no klaxon, no casualty report pinned to the board, no solemn recitation of names in a chapel that would never bother descending this far. One cycle I arrived at the slate stand, expecting the usual smear of duty rotations and grim arithmetic, and found empty space where 3 designations had been. At first, I thought it was clerical error. That was the instinct drilled into every servant of the Imperiums. Assume the system is correct, and if something appears wrong, it is you that has failed to understand. I stared at the duty board until my eyes watered, then checked the ledger, our sanitation ledger, stained and swollen from humidity, its pages soft from handling. 3 names were missing there too, not crossed out, not marked deceased, simply absent, as if they had never been assigned, as if they had never existed. The overseer shrugged when I brought it to him. Transfers, he said. Transfers where? I demanded before I could stop myself. He looked at me with dull irritation. Up, down, somewhere. Doesn't matter, you work what's posted. It was the same answer I had heard for every shortage, every denial, every vanishing. But this time it did not fit. You do not transfer sanitation crewmen without paperwork. You do not reassign bodies without signatures. The Imperium can misplace worlds, but it does not misplace forms, unless the misplacement is the point. I began watching the roster obsessively. Each cycle, another line faded. Sometimes it was a man I had seen that morning, his cough echoing in the corridor as he passed. Sometimes it was someone already gone, their absence belatedly made official by deletion. The ledger's ink did not smudge or blur like damaged writing, it simply ceased to be there, leaving clean parchment behind. The ship was not killing us, it was unwriting us. And the more names vanished, the easier it became for the system to treat the rest of us as temporary, numbers to be consumed and replaced by silence. A smaller crew meant heavier workloads. Heavier workloads meant faster failure. Faster failure meant more reassignments, which meant fewer names, which meant even heavier workloads, a perfect cycle. I tried to fight it with the only weapon I had, documentation. I began keeping my own list, separate from the official slate, a scrap of parchment tucked inside my coat, names written in tight script, pressed hard enough to leave grooves. I wrote down every person I worked beside, every designation I heard during roll call, every voice I could still distinguish in the dark. Ink and memory. It felt rebellious, though rebellion was not my intent. I did not want to overthrow anything. I wanted proof. Proof that we had been more than labor hours, that we had existed as human beings inside the ship's gut. For a while, it worked. Then the parchment began to discolor. Letters I had written blurred, as if damp had seeped into the fibers, though the scrap was kept dry against my skin. I rewrote the names, pressing harder. The grooves remained, but the ink faded anyway, as if something drank it. I tried carving a name into a bulkhead once, out of sheer desperation. The metal resisted, then yielded, leaving a shallow scratch. I stared at it in the weak lumen glow, feeling briefly triumphant. When I returned the next cycle, the scratch was gone, polished away as if it had never been made. That was when fear shifted into something heavier than fear. Resignation. The Voidship did not want records of us beyond what it required for function. The moment a name ceased to be useful to its schedules, because the body attached to that name had been consumed, reassigned, or simply erased, the system cleaned the record the way we cleaned waste channels. Efficiently, thoroughly. Sanitation was never meant to be permanent service. It was meant to be slow disposal. I realized then that sanitation workers were not expected to last. Not because the work was dangerous, though it was, but because the structure of the system assumed constant replacement. Fresh bodies from press gangs, transfers from pinhole holds, the endless tide of the lower habs. But the replacements had stopped. The ship had begun to close itself, to ration even manpower, feeding only what it could no longer repair. And the easiest thing to feed was us. The overseer disappeared one cycle. He had been shouting orders the night before, furious about a surge in the intake channels. By morning, his bunk was stripped clean, his slate wiped, his name missing from the duty board. No one asked where he went. No one wanted to. A new overseer appeared 2 cycles later, someone I had never seen, his coat cleaner than ours, his eyes already exhausted in a way that suggested he had been reassigned from somewhere else undesirable. He did not introduce himself. He simply pointed at the roster and told us to work. I began to notice something else too. My own designation remained, cycle after cycle. While names vanished around me, mine stayed fixed on the roster. I should have felt relief. Instead, it filled me with cold dread, because it meant I was still needed. Not as a person, as a function. Someone had to hold the mop, someone had to scrape the channels, someone had to keep the waste from rising high enough to inconvenience the decks above. The roster preserved me the way it preserved a tool, kept in place until it broke, then discarded. I understood that if I ever collapsed, if I ever became too sick to stand, my name would not be honored with a death entry. It would be removed, cleaned away. The idea of disappearing like that haunted me more than death itself. Death at least leaves an absence people can notice. Deletion leaves nothing, no gap, no question, no grief. It is the perfect erasure. One night, after a long shift in a sealed corridor, where the air tasted like hot metal and mold, I sat alone beside a drainage grate and listened to the ship breathe. The pumps throbbed in slow rhythm, the deck plates humming softly under strain. Somewhere far above, a hymn played faintly through the vox net, distorted by distance into something almost mournful. I looked at my hands, raw, cracked, stained permanently with grime that never fully washed away. I thought about how many times these hands had kept the ship from choking. How many dead had passed through my work zones. How many names had vanished. And I understood the final truth of sanitation service. To keep a void ship pure, someone must be treated as filth. That someone is me. I will continue to clean until my body fails, and when it does, the roster will quietly correct itself. My designation will dissolve into blank space. The ship will remain operational. The upper decks will breathe clean air and never know my name. This is my confession. I am not a hero. I am not even a martyr. I am maintenance. And when I am finally clean enough, when there is nothing left of me to clog the system, I will disappear without record, leaving the ledger pristine.